Court reporter. Via Zoom video conference 2 Monday, January 31, 2022, 10:05 a.m. Lori Grein was thereupon called as a witness herein, and after having first been duly sworn, via Zoom video conference, to testify to the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, was examined and testified as follows. Examination by Ms. Gordon. Gordon: Hi, Ms. Grein. I'm Deborah Gordon, as you know. I represent Ms. Dinverno. If you don't understand my questions, if you'd like me to repeat or rephrase, just let me know, okay? Grein: Okay, thank you. Gordon: I'm going to note for the record again Mr. Chisholm is on the call. I'm unclear why. I realize he's the district's counsel in some capacity, but he doesn't have an appearance in this record. We've covered this previously. Ms. Grein, what is your full name and address? Grein: My full name is Lori Ann Grein. My address is redacted. Gordon: You are currently employed where? Grein: I am currently employed at Rochester Community Schools. Gordon: When did you start there? Grein: 7 years ago, January, I believe it was 15th, 2015. Gordon: What were you hired in to do? Grein: I was hired as the Communications Community Relations Director. Gordon: Were you filling an open spot or was it a new position? Grein: I was filling an open spot. Gordon: Who had previously held that spot, if you recall? Grein: The position was vacant for some time. Prior to that, it was Deb Hartman. Gordon: And who were you going to be reporting to, or did you report to in 2015? Grein: I report directly to Dr. Shaner, the superintendent. Gordon: What is your pay, roughly? Grein: About $115,000. Gordon: 115, you said? Grein: Yes, about 115,000. Gordon: Is that a salary? Grein: Yes. Gordon: Where were you working before you got to Rochester Community Schools? Grein: The U.S. Army. Gordon: How long were you there? Grein: I was with the Army in some capacity since, I believe it was about 2004. Gordon: And what was your role there, employment-wise? Grein: When I left the Army, I was in communications with the Army, but I was in a transition position before I left. I believe it was a product manager. It was a very short time. Gordon: Well, what, Grein? So. Gordon: From 04 until roughly 15, what were you doing in the Army? Grein: So I worked in the volunteer program, I worked in communications, and then as a product manager, project manager. Gordon: Okay, what's volunteer in this context, when you said you worked in a volunteer area? Grein: Yeah, so the Army has a volunteer corps, and I worked with volunteers who volunteer for the Army. Gordon: And what did you do? Grein: I organized the program. I was program manager. Gordon: So I'm not really sure still what you did, though. Were you like bringing people on board or, giving them materials? What were you doing? Grein: I managed the program, so there's a lot of different volunteer positions within the Army, and it's really just recognizing the people that are doing great work and managing it, pulling it all together so my boss would know who is doing what in the organization, from a good news standpoint. So you have your volunteers with the Boy Scouts, or you have your volunteers just helping to do great things for the Army. Gordon: And where were you physically located? Grein: At that time, I was physically located on the Selfridge Air National Guard base. Gordon: Okay, and then what did you do when you took on a communications role in the Army? Grein: So I worked for several different organizations for the Army starting out at Selfridge and then moving down to Warren, Michigan, and I did communications for the Army, internal and external communications. Gordon: What does that mean, though, can you explain that? Grein: Yeah, sure. It's any of the media relations, any of the internal communications. I would have a hand in framing messaging for the organization internally and then doing the same externally and with the media. Gordon: Okay, and how long were you in the communications position? Grein: I don't recall the date that I started offhand. If you'd give me a couple of minutes, I'm just trying to go through my resume here. Gordon: Don't you, Grein? Yeah, I can get you that information. Gordon: Was there a command officer you reported to or a title? Grein. Yes, absolutely. Gordon. What was the title? Grein. There were several command officers. There was the garrison manager, there was the PEO executive officer. Gordon. Excuse me. 1 second, please. I'm just going to silence. Court reporter. Off the record at 10:11 a.m. Back on the record at 10:11 a.m. Gordon. Okay. So, why did you leave the communications area and end up in products management? Grein. Advancement. Gordon. That was an advancement position? And what was the product you were managing? Grein. As a product manager? At the time when I left, I was only in that position a very short time. I think it was only a month or two. It was transition. So with the Army, I had moved from one Army organization to another Army organization. They shared me out to help the other organization. When that time was done, I moved back to the organization that I originally was from in a different capacity, and that's where they were sending me basically to school to learn another area. Gordon. And why did you leave? Grein. Why did I leave the Army? Gordon. Right. Grein. I thought I could make a difference in the school district. Gordon. Okay. And what were you doing before you worked for the Army? Grein. I worked as a housewife and then I'm registered as a respiratory therapist in healthcare. Gordon. Okay. So what's your educational background? Grein. My educational background is I have a Bachelor of Science degree in cardiopulmonary, in respiratory therapy. I also went to school, to the Defense Information School, for Public Affairs. Gordon. Where did you obtain your college degree? Grein. From Indiana University in Pennsylvania. Gordon. Indiana University in Pennsylvania? Grein. Gordon. That's a yes? Grein. Yes. Gordon. When was that, Ms. Grein? Grein. I graduated from Indiana University in 1985. Gordon. Did you work as a respiratory therapist then? Grein. Yes, I did. Gordon. And roughly how long was that? Grein. I worked from 1985 to about 1994 in the hospital setting. I worked for doctors' offices after that for a short time. Gordon. Okay. And then your next regular full-time job was with the Army, is that correct? Grein. Correct, yes. Gordon. Okay. Grein. They sent me to school for public affairs. Gordon. And you have children, I assume? Grein. I do. Gordon. Are they in the Rochester school system? Grein. No. Gordon. Have you ever had children in the Rochester school system? Grein. No. Gordon. How did you find the job opening at Rochester Community Schools? Grein. I think one of the former board members also worked for the Army and encouraged me to apply. Gordon. Who was that? Grein. Chuck Couto, Charles Couto. Gordon. Could you spell that for me, please? Grein. Coutteau, I believe. Gordon. Was he on the board at that time and, Grein. No. Gordon. Okay. Grein. No. Gordon. So he told you there was a spot open? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay. And what's the next thing that happened after he told you about the opening? Grein. I contacted Dr. Shaner. Gordon. Did you contact him directly? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay. Was there a job posting that was up? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay. And how did you contact Dr. Shaner? Grein. By phone. Gordon. All right. So somebody connected you up with his phone number, I assume? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And who was that? Grein. Chuck Couto. Gordon. Okay. And what happened after you talked to Dr. Shaner? What was the next step? Grein. I came in for an interview. Gordon. And who did you interview with? Grein. In the room, I don't remember everybody in the room. I seem to recall Dr. Shaner and I can't remember who all was in the room, sorry. Gordon. Okay. And what happened after the interview? Grein. Then they called and offered me the position. Gordon. Okay. And when you hired in 2015, did you have a description of written job duties? Grein. I can't remember. I can't remember. Gordon. Do you have a written job description today? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And, Grein. So I would assume that I did, but. Gordon. But you can't remember when you, Grein. I can't. Gordon. And what does your written job description today include? Grein. To be honest with you, I haven't looked at it. Gordon. Ever? Grein. In a long time. It's not that I've never done it. Gordon. Well, do you follow? Is your job what's on that list of job duties? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Or is it something different? Do you do additional tasks? Grein. I don't have the job. I haven't looked at the job description. I apologize. I just haven't looked at it. Gordon. Well, what were you hired in to do, as you understood it? Grein. To be their communications community relations director. Gordon. What does that mean with regard to your day-to-day tasks? Grein. So what it means in regards to my day-to-day tasks, a big part of what I do is pay attention to the community, and then I relay that information to the senior leaders within the organization, and, again, managing the internal and external communications, helping to draft messages, helping to draft information for informational materials. Gordon. What else? Grein. Media. Media is a big part of what I do. I manage all media responses for the district. Social media also plays a role in that. Gordon. What type of social media? Grein. We have 3 accounts with the district: Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Gordon. And those are under the name of Rochester Community Schools? Grein. How they have to, yes. How we have to work it, though, there has to be a manager of the sites, at least for Facebook and Instagram. So my name is under the Facebook, it's under my name, but it's through the district. Gordon. Are you the individual who posts the material on those 3 different social media sites? Grein. I can be. Gordon. Who else can be? Grein. My department. Gordon. Okay. Are you responsible for what's posted on those sites? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Do you approve what's posted on those sites? Grein. I don't understand the question. Gordon. Who decides what's going to go on the site, the social media sites? Grein. So, do I guess, if I can ask to clarify, are you asking me if I approve every single message that goes on social media? Gordon. I think I said, who can approve? I'm not sure, but I think that's what I said. I assume somebody has to approve whatever is posted on the district's social media accounts. Is that correct or not correct? Grein. No, it's not an approval process. We look at great things going on around the district and then we share that information. Gordon. How much time is spent by you on the social media accounts, overseeing them, managing them, and whatever else is involved? Grein. Are you looking for a percentage or a time of day? Gordon. Yeah, percentage is fine. Grein. Sure, and as I'm thinking, it's just intertwined with my responsibilities, so to stop and say I designate X amount of time, I'm not sure I can do that. Gordon. I wasn't assuming you designated time. I just wanted to know roughly how much of your time, Grein, it's intertwined in my responsibilities, my daily responsibilities. Gordon. Okay, that's fine. We all have daily responsibilities, and we can pretty much, most of us can figure out how much time do I spend answering phone calls, how much do I spend doing this or that, roughly. Is it a significant part of your time, a small amount of your time? How would you, Grein, perhaps an hour a day, up to? Gordon. Okay, how much of your time is spent on media? Grein. Again, that's dependent. Some days are extremely busy, some days are, I don't get any media inquiries. Gordon. Right. The media inquiries, I assume, are more sporadic, would that be correct? Grein. Correct. Gordon. You said you draft informational materials and messages. What are you referring to there? Things to go out to the people in the district. Grein. Correct, yes. Gordon. And then you said you pay attention to the community. What does that mean? Grein. To know what topics are going on in the community so we can inform our communications. Gordon. Explain that. What's your communications? I thought you were the communications? Grein. I draft communications. Is that, Gordon? Yeah, so you said to see what's going on in the community so you can advise your communications. Grein. Yeah, wait. So I think so we can advise the messaging that goes out. I'm the communications director, but I'm using the word communications as an actual noun. We're putting communications out to the district. Gordon. Okay, you mentioned the word department. Is there a communications department at the district? Grein. It's called Community Relations Department, yes. Gordon. Okay, so you work in community relations? Grein. Gordon. And your official title is what? Communications Director. Grein. Executive Director of Strategic Communications. Gordon. Executive Director of Strategic Communications is your title? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And who, and this is in a department called what? Grein. It's a department. Gordon. What's the name of your department? Grein. The department is Community Relations. Gordon. And who else is in the department other than you? Grein. Underneath me, there's 4 individuals. We have the receptionist of the district. I have a secretary. I have a public affairs specialist. And I have the RCS Foundation coordinator. Gordon. Who is the public affairs specialist? Grein. Amy D. Kress. Gordon. I'm sorry, what was the last title you gave? Grein. The RCS Foundation coordinator. Gordon. Who is that? Grein. Joanne Baden. Gordon. Did you hire any of the 4 individuals who report to you? Grein. I hired Amy D. Kress and Joanne Baden. Gordon. Did you know Amy D. Kress prior to hiring her? Grein. Yes, I did. Gordon. How did you know her? Grein. She was on the PTA. Gordon. So she was a parent? Grein. She is, yes, a parent in the district. Gordon. When was she brought on board, roughly? Grein. Roughly 4 years ago. Gordon. What are her job duties? Grein. Amy D. Kress manages our social media. That's one of her primary responsibilities. She also helps with messaging for the district as well. Gordon. And in that context, what does messaging mean? Grein. Messaging, if I could give you an example? Gordon. Sure. Grein. We had just recently a crossing guard passed, and she would help draft a message to go out to the community about the passing of the crossing guard. So that's the type of messaging. Gordon. And she reports to you? Grein. Yes, she does. Gordon. Do you evaluate her performance? Grein. Not formally. Gordon. Okay, is your performance evaluated? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And is that by Dr. Shaner? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Do you meet regularly with Dr. Shaner with regard to the duties you've described here today? Grein. I don't understand the question. Gordon. Do you meet regularly with Dr. Shaner to discuss the duties and responsibilities you've described here today? Grein. So, we discuss, if I could clarify, are you asking if we discuss my job description or the actual, the actions of what's going on in the district? Gordon. It would be the latter. Grein. So I meet with Dr. Shaner just about every day. We talk, yes. Gordon. Okay, where are you located physically today? Grein. I'm at my house. Gordon. Okay, is anybody with you there? Grein. No, I'm the only person in this room. Gordon. Okay, what materials have you had a chance to review to get ready for your dep? Grein. I didn't review materials. Gordon. You've looked at nothing? Grein. I looked at one. I think there was one media story. I think it was from the Detroit News. Gordon. What was that about? Grein. It was reporting about the Elena Dinverno current case. Gordon. Okay, that's all you looked at to get ready for your deposition? Grein. Yes. Gordon. You have not looked at the emails that were produced to me that have your name on them? Grein. No. Gordon. Did you produce those emails to somebody? Grein. I'm not sure what emails you are referencing. Gordon. Were you asked to produce any documents in response to the plaintiff's request in this case to produce documents? Nichols. Just place an objection to the extent that you are asking her to talk about communications that would have come from my office. They're privileged. She's not to discuss anything communicated by my office. Gordon. Okay, so I disagree, but I can take an answer, a yes or no, as to whether she was asked to produce anything. So even if it came from your office, I can take a yes or no. Were you asked to produce anything? Nichols. I just want to be careful. We're in the scope of the privilege here. Gordon. Okay, Alright, go ahead. Grein. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Gordon. Were you asked to produce any documents in response to our request to the district to produce certain documents and materials? Were you asked to produce anything? Grein. No, Gordon. Nobody asked you, Grein. Not that I'm aware. Gordon. Nobody asked you to search out emails you may have sent, for example? Grein. No, I think it's my understanding that my attorneys are working to get email messages, but not. I've never been asked. Gordon. So you have not produced any materials to anybody in the district or a lawyer? You've not produced any materials that might be relevant here? Grein. No, Gordon. Okay, you have sent emails to Dr. Shaner about Elena Dinverno, is that correct? Grein. I don't know. I don't remember. Gordon. You communicated with him at the time the lawsuit was filed, is that correct? Grein. Have I? Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry. Could you, Gordon? Sure. You communicated with him in writing, by email or text or whatever, around the time the lawsuit was filed, is that correct? Grein. I don't have a recollection of that. Gordon. Well, you're in charge of communications. Grein. Gordon. You are in charge of media. Grein. Gordon. This was a media story, wasn't it? You just got done saying you read a Detroit news piece. Grein. Right. Gordon. Okay, so this was a big media piece for the district, correct? Grein. Sure. Yeah, I don't recall. I really, so much comes through my desk, it really does, and I don't recall. I mean, I just don't recall. I know that we can look that up, but. Gordon. How would we look that up? Grein. You can look up my emails. I mean, we can look at my emails. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Courtney's office is getting you those emails. Gordon. Okay, so the lawsuit is filed. It gets into the media. You're the head of communications. Grein. Gordon. Your district has just been sued for potentially or allegedly violating somebody's constitutional rights, correct, or other torts, is that right? Grein. It appears so, yes. Gordon. Well, did you read the lawsuit at some point when it came in or learn about it from others? Grein. I read it, yes. I read it in the news. Gordon. Okay, so you're the communications person. What do? You are there to send a message out, you do messaging, you do communications, you do media, so I assume all of this falls under your umbrella. Grein. Gordon. So what do you do when the lawsuit comes out? Grein. I don't know what I did. I don't remember what I did when the lawsuit came out. I don't remember. I mean, it seems like it was so long ago. I just don't remember. We can look it up, but I just don't remember. Gordon. What have been the biggest media stories in the last 3 years with you as communications director at the district? Tell me what you recall as the biggest media stories vis-a-vis Rochester schools. Grein. Well, COVID-19 is probably the biggest one. Gordon. Well, was that a media story about Rochester schools? Grein. No, I mean, that was just. Gordon. Okay. Was there a media story about Rochester schools vis-a-vis COVID? Grein. It was not about Rochester schools. I mean, Rochester schools was part of it. Gordon. Okay, so something directly about Rochester schools. What have been the biggest media stories in the last several years? Grein. It was one of the biggest media stories was a teacher that had inappropriate relations with a student. Gordon. And when was that? Grein. I can't give you an exact date. Gordon. Give me a rough idea. Grein. 4 years ago, 3 years ago. I don't. Gordon. Okay, what else? Grein. There's been stories in the news. You're asking for the biggest stories or just the ones that I can remember? Gordon. Well, I assume there haven't been that many stories. Grein. Yeah, but, I mean, there's lots of good news stories in the news, too. Gordon. Yeah, I didn't say good or bad. I'm just looking for big media stories. Grein. Yeah, Gordon. So tell me what else you recall. Grein. We had the Secretary of, what's the U.S. Secretary of, I want to say Human Resources. I don't remember his title now. It was a big story that he came to visit us. Gordon. Was that in the free press and the news or just the local paper? Grein. Channel 7 covered that, and then other media sources covered it, as well, I believe. Gordon. So what was the point of the visit? Grein. At the time, the focus was on childcare. Gordon. Okay, what other media stories? Grein. You know what? I think I just need more context. I'm just not sure what. Gordon. Okay. Well, how many stories, since I don't see that many school districts in the major metropolitan news outlets very often, so that's what I'm getting at. How many times has Rochester schools actually had any sort of a statewide story? Is it very many times? I would think not, but maybe I'm incorrect. Grein. A statewide story, Gordon. Yeah. Grein. Or a story in the Detroit. Gordon. Either one, the free press or the news, I assume, have. Grein. Dr. Shaner has quite a healthy relationship with the media, and we were constantly being asked to support different stories. There's, Gordon. I don't know what that means, you were being asked to support other stories. What does that mean? Grein. To interview for other stories. Gordon. Okay, so, again, that's not really my question. I'm trying to find out stories about Rochester schools. The Elena Dinverno lawsuit, federal lawsuit, got media attention. I'm aware of that. You haven't even mentioned that one here when I asked you to list the stories. And so I'm just trying to find out if there's been any other significant news events having to do with the media that would be comparable to Elena Dinverno. So let me ask you that. Grein. I'm sorry, what are you asking me? Gordon. Any other big news stories that have run, other than the one with the teacher and the student, that have run that you can think of? Grein. So we have a lot of stories that have ran. We just purchased a new administration building. Dr. Shaner talks about social-emotional wellness to a lot of different media outlets. That's been continuous for the past several years. That's been huge in the media. Gordon. Where has that been in the media, social and emotional wellness? Grein. Yes. Gordon. What media outlets has that run in? Grein. That ran in. I don't recall all the names of the media outlets, but that had quite a bit of media draw. Gordon. Well, do you remember any newspaper that ran in? Grein. Well, over time. Yeah, it wasn't just a one-time deal. This was over time. And over time, I would say at some point, again, I don't know the exact media outlets, but we had quite a bit of media draw. I can look that up for you, but, Gordon. Yeah, I can, that's okay. Grein. Okay, Gordon. But I'm not understanding the point of what was in the media. Was it just him commenting on social and emotional wellness in the Grein? It's a priority with the district. I'm sorry, I should have let you finish. Gordon. Okay, well, that's not my concern, whether it's a priority with the district. I'm just trying to get to media coverage of major, news events, okay? And so, Grein. So at one point, Gordon. What else have you got? Grein. Yeah, at one point we had a huge press conference, and quite a few media was there for the Social and Emotional Wellness Initiative. Gordon. When was that? Grein. I want to say 4 years ago. I don't know the exact date. Gordon. Okay, so, we file our lawsuit in May of 2021, and the story is picked up on metropolitan Detroit news outlets and other places, correct? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. You're the head of communications and you don't know? What is, Grein? Gordon. Hang on a second, Ms. Grein. Let me finish. Grein. I'm sorry. Gordon. You're sued in federal court by a parent, you are the head of communications, you are the head of messaging, you are the head of social media, okay? Is it part of your job to react to the story, message the story, respond to the story, or you just don't remember? Grein. There were a couple questions in there. Are you able to break those down and ask them one by one? Gordon. No, it's all the same question. Was it your responsibility to do anything with regard to this, the fact that you've now been sued and it was in the media? Grein. No, Gordon. Okay. Whose responsibility was that? Grein. If the media asks me a question, it is my job to respond. Gordon. Okay. Well, you are getting messaging out all the time about what is going on in the district. You don't need to be called by the media, correct? Grein. Correct. Gordon. Okay, so was there a response from the district as to this lawsuit? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Aha. Well, did you have any concerns, as the person that was the head of communications for the district, that this was a wide story that your members of your district and parents were going to read and you needed to figure out what was going to be said by the district? Grein. No. Gordon. Did the district offer up any comment on this? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. All right. So you must have discussed the fact that the school district was being sued for a parent who essentially was claiming that the school board was contacting her employer because they didn't like her speech. You must have discussed that with Shaner, correct? Nichols. Let me object to the form and foundation. Lori, you can answer. Grein. I'm sorry, could you ask the question again? Gordon. Lori, do you want to read that back? Court reporter. The following record was read by the reporter at 10:41 a.m., all right. So you must have discussed the fact that the school district was being sued for a parent who essentially was claiming that the school board was contacting her employer because they didn't like her speech. You must have discussed that with Shaner, correct? Grein. I don't know that I understand the question. Gordon. Did you discuss this lawsuit with Dr. Shaner? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay, what was your discussion about? What was said? Grein. I don't recall the details. Gordon. Okay, well, just give me the gist of it, then. Grein. I remember that. I remember that there was an indication of Blake's orchard in there. Gordon. In where? I'm sorry. In where? Like in your conversation? Grein. No, not in the conversation. I'm sorry, that was. So we're talking about my conversation with Dr. Shaner and what was discussed with Dr. Shaner, is that correct? Gordon. That is correct. Grein. Okay, I just can't remember the details. I truly can't. Gordon. I heard you say that, and so then I said, well, what was the gist of it? Grein. Yeah, I'm so sorry. I just can't remember the gist of it. I mean, we discussed that there was a case. I honestly can't remember the details. Gordon. So did you email with him about the lawsuit, send him the lawsuit, send him the media coverage, send it out to anybody else in the district? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Did you give a statement to the media? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Who would have been responsible for giving a statement to the media? Grein. It would have been me. It would have gone through my department, through me. Gordon. And who would have had to approve your statement? Grein. I work with Dr. Shaner to approve statements and other individuals in the community. Gordon. So I assume you would have sent him in writing what your statement was for him to take a look at it before you responded, correct? Grein. No, not necessarily. Gordon. But possibly, correct? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Do you issue formal media statements without the superintendent's approval, speaking on behalf of the district without getting the superintendent's approval? Grein. I get the superintendent's approval. Gordon. Okay, and did you talk to members of the board about the lawsuit, as well, and how the district should respond? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Okay, Grein. I usually don't talk to the board about media inquiries because we get so many of them. I just can't remember. Gordon. Okay, well, this is a little different, isn't it? The board was actually being sued, right? Some of the board? So this isn't your average media inquiry, agreed? Grein. I don't know the particulars. Gordon. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that answer. You weren't aware that the school district itself was being sued? Grein. Yes, I am aware. Gordon. Okay, and Kristen Bull is being sued, you're aware of that, correct? Grein. I didn't know that she was. No, I didn't know that. That's not correct. I didn't know that. Gordon. Wait, you're the head of communications and you didn't know the president of the school board was being sued? I think, Grein. Gordon, hang on. I thought it was your job to keep an eye on what is happening in the community. Grein. Gordon. And here you have the board president being sued, and you're saying that you didn't know that, or is it just that you don't remember it? Grein. I don't know who the lawsuit is directed to. Gordon. And at the time it was filed, you don't know that, you didn't know that, is that what you're telling me? Grein. Correct. I don't remember. Gordon. Okay. Well, do you think you would have known at the time and you just forgot, or do you think you never knew that Kristen Bull, the board president, was being named as a defendant? Grein. I'm sorry, you're, I don't know what being named as a defendant means. Gordon. She's named as a defendant in the lawsuit. Does that make sense? Grein. What does that mean? Gordon. Do you know what a defendant in a lawsuit is? Grein. So, I don't know that. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means. Gordon. Okay, I'm trying to be helpful here, but when you say, I don't know what it means to be a defendant in a lawsuit, are you saying you literally don't know what it means to be, the word defendant means? Is that what you are saying? Grein. No, I'm not, I truly am not trying to be difficult. The question was the lawsuit was against Kristen Bull is what you said. I didn't know that, and I don't know it's, by you saying she's being named as a defendant, I don't know that that means that this lawsuit is against her personally. I don't understand that. Gordon. As the head of communications, you never knew that the board president was named as a defendant in the lawsuit. I think you said yes, that you never knew that. I'm just double checking that. Grein. I don't know what that means. Gordon. Okay, I need an answer to my question. So when you say, I don't know what that means, please tell me what you don't know. Grein. When you say that she's being named as a defendant, does that mean, are you saying that that this is a case against her? Gordon. Yes, I am. Grein. Okay, Gordon. Do you know what the word defendant means in a civil lawsuit, and a plaintiff? Have you heard those terms before? Grein. Yes, I've heard those terms before. Gordon. Okay. And do you understand that a defendant is somebody that is being sued? Grein. No, I mean, I'm not an attorney. Gordon. Okay, I knew that. But you are in charge of communications, and you do handle this kind of thing. But, okay, I've got your testimony. Did you have any sessions or meetings with the board where, as a communications person, you would have discussed with them the fact that Shaner was being sued, Bull was being sued, the district was being sued? Grein. No. Gordon. Did you have any discussions with the board? Grein. No. Gordon. Were you involved in any discussions with legal counsel? That's just a yes or no. Grein. Yes. Gordon. And so that was about the lawsuit? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And have you continued to be involved in discussions with legal counsel about the lawsuit because the lawsuit is still ongoing? Grein. Courtney, are you able to help me? Gordon. No, she can't help. Nichols. Yeah, the only thing I can do is object to privilege. You can't talk about the scope, but if you've had communications with the district's lawyers about this lawsuit, then you can just answer yes or no. You cannot, Grein. So the answer, Nichols, go into what those were. Grein. Yes, so the answer is yes. I think the question that's throwing me, it says, ongoing. I talked to them one time. Gordon. You talked to them one time only? Grein. About this case? Yes. Gordon. So you haven't had any subsequent discussions with them, is that what you are telling me? Grein. I had one discussion with them. Gordon. Okay, and how about Jeremy Chisholm's office? Grein. One discussion with his office that I can recall. Gordon. As the head of communications, did you have any concerns with the fact that the lawsuit was alleging that the district had done things that were improper? Was that a concern to you in your role? Grein. No. Gordon. As communications director? Grein. Gordon. No, it was not? No? Grein. No. Gordon. Okay. Did you read the lawsuit? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Do you know, sitting here today, what the allegations are? Grein. I don't want to speculate. Gordon. So I guess the answer is no, you don't know? Grein. So, it's no. Gordon. Okay, Grein. Gordon. Were you going to add something or no? Grein. No, we'll continue. Gordon. Okay, how long have you known Kristen Bull? Grein. I've known Kristen Bull since I came to the district. Gordon. Okay, and what is your working relationship with her as board president? Grein. It's a positive working relationship. Gordon. Do you have regular meetings with her? Grein. No. Gordon. In what circumstances do you communicate with her? Grein. I will communicate with her when I think that there's something that she needs to be aware of that would help prepare her for, perhaps, a board meeting. Gordon. Okay. Do you meet with the board as a whole? Grein. In the past, so we do not meet on a regular basis. Gordon. Well, okay. So do you meet with the board? Grein. No, Gordon. That was my question. Grein. No, Gordon. I didn't ask do you meet on a regular basis. Grein. No, so the answer is no. Gordon. Okay, so you never meet with the board to give them a report or let them know what to update them on anything. Grein. No, Gordon. Do you communicate with them in writing to update them? Grein. Yes, Gordon. Okay, and what would those topics be about? Grein. It could be, most recently, it would be if there was somebody, a child hurt in one of the school buildings. I would send them a message saying that the child was hurt in a school building. I mean, that's an example of why I would send them a message. Gordon. Anything else that comes to mind? Grein. Anything that I think that they would have to know for, or want to know about within the community. I mean, yeah. Gordon. So what kind of things would those be? Grein. What kind of things within a community? I honestly, Gordon. You just got done, Grein. Yeah. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Gordon. You just got done saying you would communicate with them about things they would want to know about in the community, Grein. Gordon. And I said what are those things? Grein. Right, and I mentioned about, if a child was sick and, Gordon. Yeah, I heard that. Grein. Yeah. Gordon. What else? Grein. I could look up the messages. We could look those up and, they are there. It's not, Gordon. So, I've got you here today. You are under oath. Your job, as I understood it, was to, in part, pay attention to the community. Grein. Gordon. And I assume that you would discuss that with the board or let them know what's happening with the community. So I asked you what else you would advise them of in that regard, other than a child being hurt. Can you think of anything else? If you can't, let me know. Grein. I don't advise. I do not advise the Board of Education. Gordon. That wasn't my question at all. I don't know what you mean by advise. By advise, I mean share information. Grein. Okay, Gordon. I'm not talking about any kind of formal legal advice. Grein. Okay, Gordon. Did you advise them, for example, about a child being hurt? Grein. No, I don't advise the board, I just communicate. Gordon. Okay, well, that's how I'm using the word, advise. Grein. Okay, sorry about that. Gordon. Anything else you can think of that you have? Grein. I really can't, offhand. There's quite a bit that I have, though. I can't think of specific 21 instances, I communicate with leadership all the time. Gordon. Do you know why you are being deposed today, what relevance you have to this case? Nichols. I'm going to object to the form and foundation. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. So, Nichols, I'm just going to object. To be fair, she didn't request her own deposition. So you are asking her to testify as to why you requested her deposition. Gordon. No, that's really not what I'm asking her at all, Courtney. Nichols. I just don't understand why you are asking her why her deposition was requested by your office. Gordon. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure she probably should have an idea, but I'll take an answer anyway. Grein. When I talked to my legal counsel, Nichols. No, you cannot discuss anything that you talked about with legal counsel. It's privileged. Gordon. Yeah, I just want to know what your understanding is, just your understanding about why you are being deposed today. Do you have an understanding? Have you given that any thought? Do you have some understanding of that? Grein. I'm not sure. Gordon. Okay, Grein. I'm not sure. Gordon. Okay, do you attend board meetings? Grein. Yes, I do. Gordon. What is your role in attending board meetings? Grein. I orchestrate and coordinate the spotlight portion of board meetings at the beginning of the board meeting. I also assist with timing speakers at board meetings. Gordon. Do you socialize with Dr. Shaner at all or his family? Grein. What do you mean by that? Gordon. Socialize just means being social, getting together with him and or his family. Grein. We do not get together on a regular basis, no. Gordon. Okay, do you get together periodically, once in a while? Grein. No. Gordon. Well, what did you mean, then, when you said, we don't get together on a regular basis? Grein. We went to a wedding once together in 7 years. Gordon. Okay, so, I mean, do you know his wife? Grein. Yes, I do. Gordon. And how do you know her? Grein. I've been introduced to his wife and children many times. Gordon. On what kind of occasions? Grein. His one daughter came to the office the other day. I said hello, and we made small talk. That's not what I would consider socializing. Gordon. Okay, that's fair. Do you socialize with do you have any friends that are on the board? Are there people that you are personal friends with that are on the school board? Grein. No. Gordon. Do you know who Elena Dinverno is? Grein. No. Gordon. You've never met her? Grein. Never. Gordon. What is your working relationship with Debbie Fragomeni, the assistant superintendent? Grein. It's a positive relationship. Gordon. In what way do you interact with her? Grein. I interact with Debbie all the time, my job is to pay attention and keep my leadership informed, and that's what I do. Do we talk about our families? Sure. Gordon. I didn't ask that. Grein. Okay, Gordon. Just wanted to know whether you interacted with her. Grein. Sure. Gordon. Work-wise. And what would be the reason you would do that? Grein. Sure. I keep my leadership informed and we counsel with each other, too. Gordon. What do you mean by that? Grein. Well, if I have a question, I ask her opinion. Gordon. A question about what type of topics? Grein. Who should we include in the district critical incident team? What type of leaders should we include from the community on that team? Things like that. Gordon. All right. Guys, let's take a 5-minute break. Is that okay? Nichols. See you in a couple of minutes. Gordon. Thank you. Court reporter. Off the record at 11:01 a.m. Back on the record at 11:08 a.m. Gordon. Ms. Grein, the district obviously, I assume, closed after Governor Whitmer's emergency order in March of 2020 for a period of time, am I correct on that? Grein. We stopped in-person education. Gordon. And when was that? Grein. That was in March of, Gordon. 20? Grein. 20, has to be, 20, yes. Gordon. Okay, and whose decision was that? Grein. To go in person, it was Dr. Shainer's ultimate decision. Gordon. Well, you weren't going in person, so I'm talking about to close the building and not have in-person students. Grein. Correct, to go. Yes, to not go in person. Gordon. Okay, and then what was the alternative? What modality, if any, was provided at that time in March of 20? Grein. Sure. The students went online. Gordon. Did all students go online? Grein. At that time, yes. Gordon. All grades? Grein. Yes. Gordon. How many children, or students, I should say, I guess, are in the district? Grein. Approximately 15,000. Gordon. And for how long did students remain receiving their education online? Grein. I don't know the exact time. Gordon. Well, give me a rough idea. Grein. So students went online through the end of that school year. I believe we started the school year online, as well, remotely is what we'll call it. So they finished out the year remotely. We came back, and I believe we started remotely, again. I could look it up for you, but Gordon. Well, it's not that long ago. Grein. Yeah, I know. Gordon. What was it? When did you return to school? Did you return in September or August? Grein. So we were to return in August, and I believe we started the year remotely. Gordon. So that would be August of 2021, 2020, correct? Grein. Correct, yes. Gordon. I mean, it's not that difficult to figure it out. You start the same month every year, I assume. I assume it's late August. So now the school year begins for the 20 to 21 school year, and it's August, and you A decision is made that you are going to remain remote, is that correct? Grein. From what I recall. Nichols. Wait. You just said August 2021. Gordon. I corrected it then. I think I said 2020. Nichols. Okay, just want to be clear. Gordon. Yeah, for the 2021, Nichols, 2020. Gordon. I think it would be for the 20 to 21 school year. Nichols. So that would be August 2021, then. Gordon. No, it's August of 2020 and then the school year ends in 2021. Nichols. Okay, Gordon. All right. Go ahead, Ms. Grein. So at that point, who makes the decision you're going to remain remote? Grein. The ultimate decision came from the superintendent. Gordon. Was there a board vote on it? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. Okay, and were you involved in the decision-making process? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Who else was involved in the decision-making process? Grein. Cabinet, the superintendent's cabinet. Gordon. And who was in the cabinet? Grein. Dr. Shaner, Debbie Fragameni, Corey Heitch, Neil DeLuca. I believe it was Carrie Lawler at the time, and so it wouldn't have been Neil, sorry. It would have been Carrie Lawler, Beth Davis, Matt McDaniel, Dana Taylor, Conchetta Lewis and myself, Cindy Lindner as well. Gordon. Did the board approve this? Grein. I'm sorry, did the board approve what? Gordon. The decision that Dr. Shaner had made, was it necessary to get board approval? Grein. I don't know that it's necessary to get board approval. Gordon. Did Dr. Shaner or you or anybody or the cabinet obtain board approval? Grein. I did not obtain board approval. Gordon. Okay, did anybody? Grein. I don't believe Dr. Shaner did. Gordon. Okay, all right. So, now, August, school remains remote. For how long does that continue? Grein. I'd have to look it up, I really would. Gordon. Give me your best estimate. Grein. So, I can't remember. I do remember that after the holiday, we came back remote again. So at some point, I believe we went back in person, in kind of a hybrid mode, but I would really have to look it up. Gordon. Just give me your best estimate. Grein. That's my best estimate. Gordon. Okay, this was a huge decision for the entire district. So we are talking about 2021, we are talking roughly 1 year ago that the school still would have been remote after the holidays. Not that long ago. For how long did that continue? Grein. Again, I would have to look it up. Gordon. You can't even give me an estimate? Grein. I would have to look it up for you. Gordon. I heard that, and then I said, can you give me an estimate? Grein. I'm truly doing the best I can. Gordon. Okay, so the best you can is that you have literally no idea without, quote, looking it up, close quote, as to when the school went in person. Is that your testimony here today? Grein. Yes, Gordon. Okay, and then once the school, whatever the date is, I will find it out and let you know during the dep. But once the school, did the school go back? Your district go back by the end of the school year? Grein. I can't remember. Gordon. So the end of the school year would have been June of 2021, is that right? Grein. The end of the school year is June of 20, Gordon, go ahead. So sitting here today, you do not know if students were remote or in person in May and June of 2021, is that your testimony? Grein. Yes, Gordon. So, once you went online in March of 2020, did you come to learn what the community reaction was? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Or reactions. Okay. How did you find that out? Grein. Well, social media was a big part of how the community expressed themselves. We also have the Talk to RCS feature on our website and communication with the board. Gordon. When you say social media is a big way the community expresses itself, what are you referring to? Give me a specific example. Grein. Social, when individuals come in on our social media posts, we watch to see what they are saying. Gordon. So where are your social media posts posted where you saw this? Grein. Facebook, generally Facebook. Gordon. Is this the Rochester Community Schools Facebook page? Grein. Yes, the Rochester Community Schools Facebook page. Gordon. Okay, and can anybody comment on there that wants to? Grein. Once a post is made, yes. Gordon. And what kind of comments were you getting on the Rochester Community Schools Facebook page upon the closure of the schools in 2020, March 2020? Grein. I can't remember specific. Gordon. What was the general, Grein? General, either people were for remote learning or against it. Gordon. Yeah, I figured that, but was there what was the split? Were you getting more support or less support? Grein. I didn't document. I don't remember documenting any of that. Gordon. Okay. So where else were you learning about the community's reaction to the closure of the schools in 2020, other than on the RCS Facebook page? Grein. The Talk to RCS feature on our website and communication with the board. Gordon. Okay, Talk to RCS. Tell me what that is. Talk to RCS, for the record. Grein. That's a feature on the district's website. You can click on it and submit a question or share a thought. Gordon. And who does that go to? Grein. I receive it. Gordon. Is your thought publicly posted, or is it just a question directly to somebody from the district? Grein. It is not publicly posted. Gordon. Okay, so the public posts would have appeared on the RCS Facebook page? Grein. Those would be public posts, correct. Gordon. Okay. Throughout 2020, was there any other place you mentioned the words social media several times with regard to your ability to see what the community was thinking? Where else were you able to obtain information as to what the community was thinking? On Grein. Other public. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. I'm sorry. I thought you were done. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. Other public social media sites. Gordon. And what were those? Grein. Sites are varied. I do belong to I think there's an Advocates for Rochester Community Schools and an Agents for Change. Gordon. Hang on 1 second, please. I'm sorry. Advocates for Grein. I believe these are the correct names. Rochester Community Schools and then an Agents for Change. Gordon. And Advocates for Rochester Community Schools as a Facebook group. Grein. Yes. Gordon. Page? Okay. And you are a member of that? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay. And what was the other one you mentioned? Grein. Agents for Change. Gordon. What is that? That's a Facebook group, as well, or a page? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Is it a public or private? Grein. I don't know. I do belong to it, though. Gordon. Okay. And what is Agents for Change? Give us just an overview. Was it directed to the COVID situation or something else? Grein. People can post anything on there. Gordon. Well, how long have you been a participant on Agents for Change? Grein. 2 years, I think. Gordon. Is this something that cropped up around the time of the COVID closings, or was it already in existence? Grein. I don't remember. There's a couple pages out there, and they've switched ownership. Gordon. What does that have to do with anything? What's your point there? Grein. So, the names could have changed I guess, where I'm going with that, or the names, at least one did change. Gordon. Okay, do you know which one changed? Grein. I think it's the Advocates for Rochester Community Schools had a different name. Gordon. Okay, what other Facebook or other social media pages or accounts were you able to obtain information from, other than what you've already described here today? Grein. Rochester Community Cares is another one that we frequently access. Gordon. What is that group? Is it parents? What is that? Grein. It's a community Facebook page. Gordon. And it's about the schools or the community as a whole? Grein. No, community as a whole. Gordon. Are you a participant on that page or a member? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay, where else did you obtain information as to how people were reacting or what the community was thinking? Grein. Those are the sites that I obtained communication. Gordon. Okay, and how about anybody else in your office? Were they obtaining information from other sites? Grein. I don't know the answer to that. Gordon. Did you assign people from your office to monitor any of these accounts that you've mentioned or any others after the COVID closure? Grein. So the question I'm hearing is, did I assign anybody, and, again, monitoring social media and assessing, just paying attention to what the public is saying is part of our job. So that's what we do. We want to pay attention to what the community is saying so we can, and I will give you an example. You know, when we would write our frequently asked questions, we want to know what the community is saying so we can help answer those questions. So that is part of what we do. Gordon. Okay. And you, so who assigns that work to people? You? Grein. It's not so much an assigned job as it is what we do. Gordon. Well, you have assigned it to people, though, haven't you? Grein. It's what we do. Gordon. I heard that. And then I said, but you have assigned it to people, haven't you? Grein. Did I? So to be very clear, I do have my department review social media. So in that respect, yes, I have them look at social media. Gordon. Okay, who do you have look at social media? Grein. So, really, anybody in my department can look at social media. Gordon. What's the assignment given, look at what? Grein. Well, just we want to hear what the community is saying and, Gordon, I didn't ask that. I said what are they supposed to look at to get this information? Grein. Oh, I'm sorry, which sites? Gordon. Well, yes, if that's what you're on. I don't know if you are following Twitter or what, but, yes, let's talk about sites. Grein. Okay, Gordon. What sites did you want them to monitor or tell them to monitor or look at? Grein. So, I asked them to monitor the Rochester Community Schools District School District sites. Gordon. Okay, is that the ones you've already cited here today, Advocates for RCS, Agents for Change, Rochester Community Cares? Grein. Those are not school district sites. Gordon. Okay, fair enough. So you told them to monitor the school district site, the actual school district sites? Grein. Correct. Gordon. Anything else? Grein. And as part of what we do, as we monitor other sites to get an informed decision of how we want to put our communications out, there's also we also monitor. I'm sorry, bear with me as I remember the name. Oh, it's finding the right answer. I think it's a website. Gordon. Okay, what's that? Can you explain that one? Grein. No, it's something that a community member or parent put together. Gordon. Okay, about school closures? Grein. About whatever the individual wants to post. Gordon. Well, you guys monitored it, so what was it about, as you understood it? Grein. Honestly, there's not one topic. Gordon. Give me the range of topics, since somebody was monitoring it from your office. What did you learn about it? Grein. So the individual that created that site also seems to send us a lot of what's posted, so, you know, it's, Gordon. Well, you wouldn't know that unless you knew what either Grein. Right. Yeah, so, Gordon. Listen, let's just be clear here. You said you had somebody look at the sites this is our job. However you said it, you are on the record. You've now mentioned another site, finding the right answer. I just wanted to know what was being posted there. Grein. Yeah, again, the individual really wants to recall our board, so there's a lot of bad information that's out there. That is, I think, the primary focus of that site. Gordon. Okay, so why are you spending time on that site? Is it mainly just one person's blog? Grein. I believe that there can be. I think there was an open Facebook, and I believe it's closed. I don't know if the Facebook post is still public or the Facebook page is still public, but there is a blog out there. Gordon. Okay, what other sites? Grein. I'm sorry, what other site do we look at? Gordon. Yes, that's the question. Grein. Those are the sites that I look at. Gordon. Okay, well, how about anybody else in your office? What other sites do they look at, or have we covered it? Grein. I can't answer that. Gordon. Have we covered it? Grein. I don't know. I can't answer that. Gordon. Well, you are the director, so who can answer it? Grein. I am the director, but individuals can go on their own sites, I mean. Gordon. Okay, so I'm unclear on this. This is taxpayer time during the workday, correct? Grein. Gordon. That's a yes? Grein. We are employed by the school district. Gordon. Yeah, I knew that. I said this is taxpayer time during the workday that people are doing this, correct? Grein. That we look at, yes, when I work during the school day, yes. I work for the school district. Gordon. So I'm unclear on this. You keep saying, it's our job to monitor, and then I've tried to find out what you monitor, and now you are telling me, well, you are not really sure. So are you telling me that people that work under you can spend their workday just on social media, in general, looking around, or are there some parameters to this? Grein. No, I'm sorry. I must have misunderstood. I thought you were asking if there's sites that I directed or asked people to look at and, Gordon. Yeah, that was part of it. That was a few questions back. So what was the directive to the staff as to what they are to be doing on government time, Grein? Well, Gordon. With regard to social media, what are they to be doing? Grein. So with regard to social media, it's to really share what we do with our good news stories, because we want to share that. Gordon. Hang on a second. I'm really sorry. I have to interrupt you. This is not responsive. I'm not asking you about sharing your good news. We covered that already. I'm asking about your monitoring and your department's monitoring of the community and what the community is saying. Remember that? I mean, we were talking about your desire to see what the community is thinking. So that's the question I'm on. Grein. Okay, Gordon. Not what you are posting. Are you with me? Grein. Okay, gotcha. Gordon. Okay, so I'm now trying to find out what. You said you were doing that by going to social media sites. Grein. Gordon. And I said, okay, which ones? And you have given me some names. Grein. Gordon. And then I said, what else? And then you said something about, well, your staff does stuff. I'm paraphrasing. So now I want to know what they are doing. What else are they looking at? Grein. I don't know what else they are looking at. Gordon. Well, do they have some parameters, or can they just troll around social media all day long wondering if they might find some reference to Rochester? Grein. I don't have parameters. Gordon. Okay, would you please answer my question now? Grein. Nichols. Wait. I'm just going to make an objection. Your question was, do they have parameters, and she said they don't. Gordon. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. I moved past that. And then I said, so they can just spend their day visiting various social media sites of their choosing, is that what you are telling me? Grein. I'm telling you there's no parameters. Gordon. Okay, but that wasn't my question. My question was, so does that mean, well, who specifically does this, other than you? Grein. Social media as Amy D. Kress. Gordon. Okay, so could Amy D. Kress just spend her day like, anybody she knows in Rochester, I'm going to go visit their page. It might be a girlfriend, might be a neighbor, might be a parent, I'll just go visit this parent's page. Is that how she is to conduct this inquiry or this review that she is doing? Grein. There's no parameters, so I would say yes. Gordon. How much time did you spend in 2020, post-March 2020, on various social media sites? Grein. I don't know. I don't know. Gordon. Okay, how about Ms. D. Kress, how much time did she spend? Grein. Ms. D. Kress spends, I would say, probably about 60 to 70% of her day on social media, if I was to give a percentage. Gordon. Okay, well, you haven't listed enough social media sites so far for her to spend 6. What are her hours? Grein. She works flexible hours, but generally an 8 to 5 job. Gordon. What does she do with the other 30 or 40% of the time? Grein. So we're a really super large district, so when you say, social media, it's not like a personal social media site. You've got, 23 schools to share information about. So, Gordon. Again, you are on a totally different topic. I'm talking about monitoring other people's or entities' social media, not posting stuff for the district. Grein. Okay, Gordon. Do you understand that? Grein. Okay, I thought that the question was how much was she on social media. So I don't know how much time, Gordon, monitoring social media. Grein. I don't know how much time is spent monitoring. Gordon. And what do you do with this material that is, you or Ms. D. Kress are monitoring? What happens to it? What is the usefulness of it? Grein. So when a topic is found that could help another department or organization, either a screenshot or a copy will be sent to that individual. Gordon. What else? Grein. That's it. Gordon. Well, give me an example, then. Grein. An example would be one of the topics in the community right now seems to be on books and libraries and which books are appropriate to be in a library. So recently an individual posted about, I think it's 2 books that could be questionable for a library. So you need, Gordon. Okay. I'm talking about 2020. I'm talking about COVID in 2020. This is how this question and answer part of the DEP began. I wanted to know what you were doing with regard to community and parent reaction to the school closing. Do you remember that? Do you remember that question that I asked you earlier today? Grein. Yes, Gordon. Okay. And then you went ahead to tell me what you've done and you looked at your district Facebook page and then you looked at a few other social media accounts. But I'm interested in what you were doing with regard to the community's response to COVID, okay? Grein. It would be the same process. Gordon. Okay. So if something jumped out for an individual, you would take a screenshot and send that to the individual, is that correct? Grein. Not to the individual themselves but to whoever might be able to help with the situation. Gordon. Okay. Did this activity with social media accounts continue into 2021? I assume it did, the way you described it now for 2020. Grein. This is something that we always do. We've done it before that time, and we continue to do that. Gordon. Aha. Has there come a time where you've presented this material to Shaner, Fragameni, the board? Do you present results of what you are learning? How does that happen? Grein. So, once we get a social media post, we will present it to whoever we think can help with it. Gordon. Yeah, I did hear that. Grein. Whether that be Dr. Shaner or Debbie Fragameni or one of the other members of cabinet, a principal. Gordon. Other than that, do you distribute information about what you've learned to the board, other than individuals who may have a particular interest? Do you distribute information about what you've learned from the community reactions to the board? Grein. Yes, if I think it will be helpful. Gordon. Okay. When have you done that or when would it be helpful? Grein. It's very rare that we would send the board social media posts. Gordon. On what occasions has that occurred that you can recall here today? Grein. I can't recall. Gordon. You can't recall any? Grein. No, not at this time. Gordon. So, am I correct that you assigned Ms. Decress to document negative comments being made on social media posts? Grein. I think why I'm struggling with not finding if that's a yes or no question as we document what's on social media, whether positive or negative. Gordon. Okay. Well, you didn't tell me that before. You didn't tell me you documented it. You said if there was an individual who, Grein. Well, it's not really Doc. Gordon. Hang on a second, please. You said if there's an individual that needed to get something, you would send it, and then I said, would you keep the board advised or Dr. Shaner or anybody? And you said, well, you said what you said, but it was basically not really or you couldn't remember. Nichols. I'm just going to object to the foundation. Is there a question? Gordon. There was. Nichols. Can we get back to the question, because I think it's been lost in that. Gordon. Yeah, well, I think your objection interrupted it, but give me a second. So you told me earlier that you sent material that you had observed on some social media site as needed to individuals. Lori, read back my last question, please. Court reporter. The following record was read by the reporter at 11:43 a.m. You said if there's an individual that needed to get something, you would send it, and then I said, would you keep the board advised or Dr. Shaner or anybody? And you said, well, you said what you said, but it was basically not really or you couldn't remember. Gordon. Okay, so do you keep the board advised about comments? Earlier you said you didn't. Are you saying now you do or what? Grein. Blank. Gordon. Did you hear my question? Grein. I did. Gordon. Okay, Grein. I will keep the board advised of, so, I have a good working relationship with the board, and I will share information with the board if applicable. I generally do not share social media posts with the board. Gordon. Okay, well, did you share social media posts with the board when you were getting reactions to what was happening vis-a-vis school closure? Grein. I can't remember. Gordon. You can't remember, that's your testimony? Grein. That's correct. Gordon. So you don't remember assigning Amy Decress, strike that. You assigned Amy Decress to document every single bit of information she could find on social media sites that was negative about the board, didn't you? Grein. No, Gordon. And you put all the information together, every single thing, and created very large packets of information all about negative commentary and sent it to the board, is that correct? Grein. No, Gordon. Okay, I have an email from you dated the 11th of January 2021 from Lori Grein to Kristen Bull, CC Debbie Fragameni, subject, accusation and assumptions, attachments, protesters. Importance, hi. Amy has done an amazing job documenting information. This was posted on the Parents for In-Person Learning Facebook page. Attached is the discussion that began about this evening's board meeting. It turned into a conversation with accusation and assumptions that the board is contacting employers. Redacted, sick, proposes calling cranes. Respectfully, Lori. Attached to this email from you are roughly 100 pages, 150 pages. You don't remember that, I guess, huh? Grein. I don't. I remember us compiling information, but, I don't remember the email itself. But we compile information on so much. You have to understand, this isn't just, it's what we do. It's what we do. We monitor, Gordon. Is it what you do? Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Grein. What we do is get a pulse of the community on so much. This is just one part of what we do, Gordon. Oh. Grein. So, Gordon. Have there been other times where you cut and pasted or printed off over 150 pages of what parents are saying about the district that is only negative or mainly negative? Has that happened before? Grein. We monitor. I think I had mentioned, Gordon. You've said this many times, we monitor. And I've also asked you what you do with what you monitor. You may not recall that testimony, but I do. You told me what you did with what you monitor, okay? And you certainly didn't include in your answer that you print off 150 pages and send it to the president of the board. But your record will speak for itself. I'm not going to argue with you about what you said. You are under oath and it's documented. So here I have you being happy and saying what an amazing job Amy has done on the Parents for In-Person Learning Facebook page. Now, when I asked you earlier today, Ms. Grein, what Facebook sites you visited or your office visited, you gave me a list, but you didn't include Parents for In-Person Learning, did you? You didn't. Grein. I didn't. Gordon. The record speaks for itself. Grein. No, I didn't. I didn't. Gordon. And that was intentional on your part, wasn't it? Grein. No, Gordon. Well, how is it that your office can print off 150 pages from Parents for In-Person Learning and give it to the board president and a year ago and you just don't remember? How can that be? How could it be that you literally didn't mention that site to me when you had somebody print off at least 150 pages of what they posted? Grein. Alls I can tell you is the last 2 years have been extremely, extremely stressful for us, and, Gordon. Yeah. 1A. We're doing the best that we can for our kids, and that's Gordon. So that's why you, under oath here today, you came here for your dep. That's why you just couldn't remember all this. It's just been stressful? Grein. Yes, Gordon. All right. So now that I've told you, do you remember page after page after page of cut and pastes of parents and community members raising concerns? Does that now refresh your recollection or not? Grein. I don't remember the email itself, no. Gordon. No, it's not one email, it's hundreds of emails and chats. Do you remember looking at that and saying what an amazing job Amy had done? Grein. No, I don't remember that. Gordon. Was that your idea to do that or Dr. Shainer's idea? Grein. To print off the copies? To send an email? To do what? Can you be more specific, please? Gordon. What I just got done telling you. I'll read this email again. Amy has done an amazing job documenting information. This was posted on the Parents for In-Person Learning Facebook page. Attached is a discussion that began about this evening's board meeting. It turned into a conversation with accusations and assumptions. So whose idea was it to do this? Grein. We monitor social media all the time. We try and get a pulse. Gordon. Would you answer my question, please? Grein. So that's, but to be specific to this particular thing, Gordon. Yeah. Whose idea was it to have Amy do an amazing job, to take her time to do all this, to put this together and then for you to read through it? Because you read through all of this. You called this material accusations and assumptions. Was this your idea? Was it Amy's idea? Was it Dr. Shainer's idea or, Grein? I don't remember. Gordon. Okay. Now, is Parents for In-Person Learning, is that Facebook page private? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Well, is anybody from your office a member of it? Grein. Parents for In-Person Learning. I thought that was the one that switched over to a different Facebook page. Gordon. I didn't ask you that. Grein. Okay, I'm sorry. What's your question? Gordon. What was the question, Lori? Court reporter. The following record was read by the reporter at 11:53 a.m. Well, is anybody from your office a member of it? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. You're referring to it as Parents for In-Person Learning on January 11, 2021. Who was a member of this group? Grein. It would have been me if I was a member. Gordon. But what if you weren't? Would somebody have been surreptitiously monitoring this? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. What were you referring to when you referenced the protester site? What site were you referencing? Grein. The protesters site is what we referenced, I believe it was and I'm trying to remember the name. It's one of the Facebook pages that we frequently looked at. Gordon. Why are you using the word protester to talk about the community and parents? Grein. Originally, the reason we originally referred to it as protester is because I believe, if memory serves me, that's how the page started. An individual wanted to protest remote learning. They wanted the in-person learning. I can't remember which page that was, the name of it. Gordon. You sent an email on September 10, 2020 to Amy D. Kress, with a CC to Dr. Shainer, offering up your own opinions on this. Do you recall that? Grein. No, Gordon. And you yourself were following these sites, weren't you? Grein. I do look at the sites, yes. Gordon. Again, these are not sites you referenced to me earlier. You sent. Okay, so here's one of your emails, the 10th of September 2020. In line with Amy's input below, Mr. Engblom, one of the commenters who sent the BOA message this morning, wrote on the protest site, quote, "Make sure you keep the pressure on RCS. We can't get complacent," close quote. He then posted his message that you received this morning. Why are you sending this out? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. Were you asked to do this by Dr. Shainer? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. So, I assume you're not telling parents, we are monitoring all of your posts and compiling them. You didn't tell parents that, did you, as part of your communications outreach? Grein. We monitor public information sites. Gordon. Lori, would you read back my question, please? Court reporter. The following record was read by the reporter at 11:56 a.m. So, I assume you're not telling parents, we are monitoring all of your posts and compiling them. You didn't tell parents that, did you, as part of your communications outreach? Grein. No, Gordon. What was wrong with Mr. Engblom writing, make sure you keep the pressure on RCS? We can't get complacent, why would you even bother mentioning that to somebody? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. And you were sending Kristen Bull these emails, too, weren't you? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. And she wanted to know who the emails were coming from. She said, are these individuals from the same school? Do you remember getting a question from her on that? Grein. No, Gordon. This is from Kristen Bull to you, Thursday, September 10, 2020, CC Dr. Shainer. Hi, team. Wondering about the source of these emails that are coming fast and furious re-elementary remote learning this morning, at least 4 in the past hour. Are these individuals from the same school? Was there something posted on Facebook suggesting they reach out? Just curious of the source. I won't be able to respond to any of these until later today. Do you recall that? Grein. No, Gordon. On Thursday, November 5, you send an email to Shainer and Fragameni, CC Amy D. Kress, subject, Children in Distress. Does that ring a bell? Grein. Yes, Gordon. And you wrote, please see Amy's message below. How horrifying for these children. Do you remember that? Grein. Yes, Gordon. And what you were referring to was Amy D. Kress's email, subject, Children in Distress. Once again, they are calling for videos of kids in distress. I know parents are giving permission for this, but can't we supersede in protecting these kids? Elena Louise is the Facebook profile name. Her real name is Elena Dinverno, parent of blank and blank. And then her email is included, as are 2 phone numbers of her. I will start with this. Why is Elena Dinverno's Facebook name being sent around? And why are you sending it forward? And why are her children's names in here? Why is her email address in here? And why are her phone numbers in here? Nichols. I'm going to object to the form and foundation of that question. There were, I think, 3 subparts. Gordon. Yes, but it's all in one sentence. Her real name is Elena Dinverno, parent of blank and blank, and then you give her email and pass along 2 phone numbers. Why was that done? Grein. Why did I forward the email? Is that the question? Gordon. No, that wasn't the question. Do you want it read back to you? Grein. Please. Court reporter. The following record was read by the reporter at 12:01 p.m. Her real name is Elena Dinverno, parent of blank and blank, and then you give her email and pass along 2 phone numbers. Why was that done? Grein. I don't know. I don't recall. Gordon. So who took their time to figure out who Elena Louise was, and it was really Elena Dinverno? Who took that time? Grein. There was. Amy D. Kress is the one that shared that information. Gordon. I know that. I said whose idea was it? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Okay, and you passed this along. And why were her children's names pulled? Grein. When we find information that we think could be concerning or could be helpful, we generally share what school the kids are from. So that way, if it's something that the principal can address versus taking it up through the cabinet level, then the principal would address that. So we just normally want to know where the children go to school. Gordon. Okay, well, why do you want to know where the parent works? Why is Elena Dinverno's employer's name in this email to you, from D. Kress to you, which you then sent up to Bull and others? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Can you think of any reason here today that your office would have sought out my client's phone numbers? Grein. No. Gordon. And her place of employment? Grein. No. Gordon. And sent it around to others? Grein. No. Gordon. Well, what could the possible reason be? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. And then you got a note back from Kristen Bull. Please keep me posted on this one. I am producing a large event for Cranes in 2 weeks, and Blake is a sponsor. Do you remember that? Grein. I do recall that. Gordon. I would be interested to know whether she mentions me by name. Do you remember that? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And then Dr. Shaner asked you to send to your lawyer, Mr. Chisholm, video clips from board meetings where parents expressed their concerns, correct? Grein. I'm sorry, could you repeat, please? Gordon. Yes, I can. Robert Shaner asked you to pull the video clips and send them to Collins and Blaha, the law firm that wrote cease and desist letters, correct? Grein. Pull video clips from what? Gordon. Board meetings. Grein. Yes. Gordon. Why? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. But why would you be sending to lawyers what parents are saying at a meeting? What would be the purpose for that? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. You didn't ask when you took the time to pull these clips? Grein. No, I don't recall. I don't recall. Gordon. Were people upset about what Mrs. Redacted said at a board meeting? Grein. I'm sorry, could you repeat, please? Gordon. Were people upset about what Mrs. Redacted said in a board meeting? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. How about Mr. Redacted? Were people upset with what he said? Grein. At a specific board meeting? Gordon. Yes, that would be correct, and, Grein. Yeah, I don't remember a specific. Gordon. Hang on. Your email was December 15th, and you are referring to last night's board meeting. Are you with me? Grein. Yes. Gordon. Okay, so were people upset with what and said? Grein. I don't recall what they said. Gordon. Why are you sending clips to some lawyer? Is that, Grein? I don't recall. Gordon. So people could be threatened, so the community and parents could be threatened by your taxpayer paid for lawyers? Nichols. Hold on. I'm going to object to the form and the foundation. Lori, you can answer. Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. That's what happened, isn't it? These parents were sent cease and desist letters, weren't they? Nichols. Same objection to the foundation. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. I know that cease and desist letters were sent. I don't recall specifically, I don't recall that specific case. Gordon. You discussed that with Dr. Shaner, didn't you, that cease and desist letters were going to be sent? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. So you, and then you cut and pasted something, December 14, 2020, at 5:09 p.m., and this was sent around, as well. Facebook post on Parent Advocates for Rochester Community Schools, a private group with 4.3 Kelvin's members, and here's her post. Just a reminder that there is a BOE meeting tonight at 7 p.m. via Zoom. Several parents, citizens, are on the agenda, including yours truly. If you would like to speak at the meeting, you can do so at the end of the meeting, even if you are not on the agenda. Those who wish to speak should join by the Zoom link emailed on Friday. If you just want to watch the meeting, you can do it here. Why is that being cut and pasted and sent around? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Who would know? It's your office that's doing it. Who would know? If you don't know, who should I ask why redacted? Somebody literally took time to do a screenshot or cut and paste of redacted note telling people about a meeting? What's the point of that? Grein. I don't recall that specific instance. Gordon. Well, I just read it to you, so you heard my words, you heard what it said? What would be the reason for that? Grein. I don't recall that specific instance. Gordon. And then there's more posted here on the same document. Somebody named Redacted posted, I wish that when the public spoke, they could ask for a response from BOE and Shaner. It is too easier, to be ignored when there isn't a conversation. Why was that cut and pasted? Why did somebody take taxpayer money and spend the time writing that down? Grein. I don't recall that specific instance, but I can tell you that that conversation has gone on within the district for a while and we definitely want the board to be informed about how the public perceives the meetings and what type of communications we can do to help them understand processes for the meetings. Gordon. Did you ever do anything to help them understand the processes? For example, did you ever send out an email to all these protester, to use your word, parents, like, hey, let us explain the process, do you have something like that you sent out? Grein. So our communications go to the whole community and not just one population. Gordon. Okay, what did you send out that would address, we understand that people are concerned that their questions, they cannot get answers at the board meeting. Here's our process. Did you send that out telling people? Grein. No. Gordon. Okay, I've got more material here that your office put together. September 29, 2020, redacted, on Facebook. RCS Parents for In-Person Education. And you go on or your office goes on to cut and paste many of her communications. Why was that occurring? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. Who would know the answer to that? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Well, whose decision was it to cut and paste redacted comments? Grein. Again, we assess the community. What the community's topics of conversation are all the time. In this specific instance, I don't know. Gordon. This is just spying on people and then tattletaling on them, isn't it? Grein. No, Nichols. I'm going to object. Wait until I object. Object to the form and foundation. You can answer. Gordon. Who is redacted? Grein. It's my understanding that redacted is an active member on one of the Facebook groups. Gordon. Do you know her? Grein. No. Gordon. Has she said anything inappropriate? Grein. She's an active voice on social media, so she says a lot of things. Gordon. I didn't ask you that. I had a different question. Has she said anything inappropriate? Grein. It depends on what you consider inappropriate. Gordon. I'm asking you, your opinion. Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Okay. Now, you write on another email to Kristen Bull and Debbie Fragomeni on Monday, January 11, 2021. Redacted appears to have other community members championing her cause on the RCS Parents for In-Person Education page, which is separate from the Parent Advocates page. And then you have a cut and paste to Kristen Bull and Debbie Fragomeni. Why are you doing that? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. Why are you spending your time telling the president of the board and Debbie Fragomeni about parents championing causes for in-person education? Why is that worth anybody's time? Grein. It's always worth knowing what's going on in the community. Gordon. I have another email from you, Lori Grein, dated January 12, 2021. Debbie and Kristen. Amy continues to do an outstanding job monitoring social media. Do you remember sending that? Grein. I don't remember sending that. Gordon. Okay, so here Amy is continuing to do an outstanding job, in your opinion, and then you go on to say, there is concern about the new discussions taking place on the private social media site RCS Parents for In-Person Education. What was the concern? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. Well, I'll tell you what you said. Where the police should be notified. What were you referring to? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Were you upset that people were talking about organizing a sit-in at the administration building? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. I have an email from Kristen Bull to you, dated 1/13, subject, related to claims of employer calls. Have you reviewed this email recently? Grein. No, Gordon. It says, at the end of the day, this one is of the highest concern to me personally. The claim near the end, the employer told her a board member called, will be difficult for me to personally refute. What are you referring to there? Nichols. I'm just going to object to the form and foundation. You said, what are you referring to? I think you just read from the part that was Kristen's. Gordon. You are correct. Thank you. What is the issue here that you are being approached about by Ms. Bull? She's telling you this is going to be difficult for her to personally refute. What was she referring to, as you understood it? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Well, she's responding. This is Bates 591 to the information below from you, where Elena Dinverno, on what she thought was a Facebook group that was not being monitored, I guess, told her story about her employer being contacted by the school board of the district, and you were being contacted about this by Ms. Bull. Why did you cut and paste from Elena Dinverno's post about her concern that her employer was being contacted? Grein. Again, it's part of any information that we would share. Gordon. Well, obviously, you must have been aware that the lawsuit alleged that her employer was contacted, correct? Grein. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Gordon. Yeah, you must have been aware that our lawsuit alleged that Elena Dinverno's employer was contacted by somebody from the district, correct? Grein. I don't remember. Gordon. Well, you are cutting and pasting and sending to Bull the very text messages, not text messages, but posts where that's being discussed by Elena Dinverno and others. Do you recall doing that? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. 1 second, please. All right. Amy D. Kress sent you something, hang on. Let me just get this right. Amy D. Kress put together something entitled, Potential Hot Topics for February 22 Board of Education Work Session, taken from social media sites. Okay. You took what Lori put together and you sent it to Kristen Bull, do you remember that? Grein. I think you meant to say I took it from what Amy provided, is that correct? Gordon. Yes, Grein. I do recall that. Gordon. Okay. Had you instructed Amy to put together potential hot topics? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And why was that? Grein. To keep the board informed. Gordon. Okay. So one of the hot topics that Amy D. Kress listed is, I don't know if she came up with this or you can maybe tell me that, RCS is promoting a liberal leftist agenda. Who came up with that as a hot topic? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. You passed this along, though, to Ms. Bull and others, correct? Fragomeni, somebody named Christina Whitmore? Who is that? Grein. That's Dr. Shainer's executive assistant. Gordon. Okay. And you said, Amy provided an excellent recap of the potential hot topics that may be brought up at tonight's meeting. Who came up with the hot topic of RCS promoting a liberal leftist agenda? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. Are there other? If I request all of your emails for board meetings pre-COVID, will I see any documents where you are sending out lists of hot topics or cutting and pasting parents' social media posts? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Okay. Then Kristen Bull contacted you on May 4, 2021, and asked you the following. If it's easy to find, Please pull for me the posts Elena D. wrote in the fall encouraging students to send their videos. I know she previously posted it with a different name. If there's any way to know when that name changed, I would appreciate it. If there's any way to get this for a meeting I have at 8:30, I would appreciate it so much. What is that referring to? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. And you got the information for her, do you remember that? Grein. I don't remember specifically, but generally, when a board member asks for something, we do try and accommodate, yes. Gordon. I asked you earlier about some parents calling for, as you say, calling for video of some kids in distress. What are you referring to there? What was the video component that you became aware of? Grein. I recall that there were a couple of parents calling for video, for other parents to submit videos of their children in distress. Gordon. Is that your word, distress, or is that a word you saw somewhere on somebody's Facebook post? Grein. I don't recall. I don't remember. Gordon. Weren't they seeking kids to talk about their experiences from learning remotely and the effects it was having on them? Nichols. Object to the form and foundation. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. So, I recall that they were asking for videos of children in distress. Gordon. Why did you write, how horrifying for these children? Who did? Grein. I believe that. Gordon. Go ahead. Grein. I'm sorry. Please finish. Gordon. No, what did you mean by that? Grein. I believe that any child in distress should not be publicly exposed in such a manner. Gordon. Well, but you have no idea what these kids were going to say and whether they wanted to talk and express their feelings. You don't know that, do you? Grein. No, Gordon. What were the kids in distress about, as far as you understood it, such that it would be really a poor idea to put this out publicly? What was the distress? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. Well, you called it horrifying, so why did you use that word? Grein. Any child in distress being publicly exposed is horrifying, in my opinion. Gordon. So a high schooler saying, I really miss football practice. I really want to get back to band. I really want to see my friends. I don't like this, that's horrifying to you? Grein. No, Gordon. Okay, but you don't know, you have no way to tell me there was anything other than that, do you? Grein. I do know that I was part of a conversation or witnessed a conversation on the phone with another parent who was a little more descriptive. Gordon. Who was that parent? Grein. Redacted Gordon. Okay. And what did he say? Grein. I don't recall the exact point of the conversation, but I was the one listening on the conversation, and the words were, from what I recall, the word distressed was used. I would never put a child in distress, show a child in distress publicly, and that was the gist of that conversation. Gordon. Was that just the two of you on the call? Grein. That was not my call. I was listening to the call. Gordon. Who was on the call? Grein. Amy Decress and redacted Gordon. And what was the call about, as you recall it? Grein. I recall it was, as I recall, it was about, I'm not sure the initial part of the conversation. There was a discussion about children in distress on the call. Gordon. Did Mr. Redacted know you were on the call? Grein. I don't know. Gordon. He wasn't told, was he? Grein. I don't remember. I wasn't on the call. I was listening. It was on a speakerphone. Gordon. It was on whose speakerphone? Grein. It was on my speakerphone. Gordon. Had you listened in on other people's calls? Grein. As it pertains to? Gordon. These topics, school closing, children in distress, whatever. Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. You may have? Grein. I don't recall. Gordon. When did you learn that Debbie Fragomeni had called? Well, strike that. Do you know Sandy Blake? Grein. No. Gordon. Have you ever talked to her? Grein. No. Gordon. You obviously know Debbie Fragomeni, correct? Grein. Yes. Gordon. You work with her? Are you aware she's a friend of Sandy Blake? Grein. No. Gordon. When did you learn she called Sandy Blake to complain about Elena Dinverno? Nichols. Object to the form and foundation. Gordon. When did you learn she called Sandy Blake about Elena Dinverno? Grein. I didn't. Gordon. You never heard that? Grein. No. Gordon. Do you know Andrea Blake? Grein. No. Gordon. Do you know who she is? Grein. No. Gordon. You're not aware she's a teacher in the Rochester School District? Grein. No. Gordon. When's the last time you talked to Dr. Shaner? Grein. Friday. Gordon. Have you discussed your dep with him? Grein. Yes. Gordon. And what was the nature of that discussion? Grein. That I was going to be having my deposition today. Gordon. Okay, well, you must have discussed more than that. Grein. I never went through one before, so I asked him, how would it go? And he said, they are going to ask you questions that you are going to answer. Gordon. When you started in at the district, what was your initial salary? Grein. I don't recall. Oh, wait. I believe it was $105,000. Gordon. 1 second, please. Grein. Sure. Gordon. Okay, that's all the questions I have for you, and I appreciate your time, Ms. Grein. Courtney, we're going to leave the record open. Hopefully, it won't be necessary, but there is overdue discovery from defendant with regard to this witness that I believe was due to us about a week ago. Nichols. Yeah, I understand. Okay, thank you. I have no questions for you, Ms. Grein. Gordon. Thank you. Court reporter. The Zoom video conference deposition was concluded at 12:31 p.m. Signature of the witness was not requested by counsel for the respective parties hereto.